everyone, this is Heather Lottinen from the Flourish Academy. This is episode 497. Today we're talking about auto ISO settings on your camera. And the reason this came up is because last evening I was teaching a class at YM Camera and I noticed that many of the new cameras, let me back up and say, all cameras are shipped with default settings. And I think probably in the last year or two, it seems to me, I've noticed that that default setting is for ISO to be set to auto. Now, obviously, if you're shooting in auto mode, your ISO is going to be picked by the camera. But I'm talking about shooting in the other modes when the camera is set to auto ISO. Okay, and I don't know when this change happened. I don't notice. I work with a lot of different camera manufacturers, but it used to be you would set the ISO, but the default was just, it was an ISO setting and you would change it. But now the default is set to auto ISO, which is fine. I have tested this out. I don't have a problem with auto ISO, especially if you're just learning or if it works for you, like who cares? Okay, I want to talk about the D750 first because I have it in my hands. But if I press the ISO button and I use the front command dial, I can turn my auto ISO sensitivity on and off with the front command dial. ISO button, front command dial. Back command dial actually changes the ISO. But when you are set to auto ISO, your camera has a default upper limit and you need to check that. Here's why. I was working with someone yesterday and he said, sometimes my photos come out extremely grainy. So I looked at his camera. Of course it was set to auto ISO. This is a Nikon mirrorless. He has the, Z6. He has the Z6. Okay, so auto ISO, again, no problem. We went into the menu settings, which is where this has to be changed on both Canon and Nikon, and I believe Fuji and Sony as well. If you press menu and you look for the shooting menu, and usually that's designated by a little camera because the shooting menu is different than the settings menu. So you'll go to the shooting menu and what you're looking for is ISO sensitivity control. And it will say, I will tell you exactly what it will say. I will find it. It will ask you what your max limit is for your ISO setting when set to auto. So I have ISO auto sensitivity on max setting 6400 ISO because that's what I'm comfortable with at a wedding. If I'm in auto and the camera goes up to 6400, I don't have any problem with that. But this gentleman, in his case on the Z6, his auto ISO maximum sensitivity was set to 51,200, which is pretty high. And listen, the Nikon mirrorless cameras do an amazing job at high ISOs. There is no denying that, but I don't necessarily want a photo shot at ISO 51,000 if I did not know that that's what it was choosing. That's my sort of issue with auto ISO is you have to pay attention to what it's selecting or you just have to trust that you have set everything appropriately. Okay, so on my D750, I have my maximum sensitivity set to 6400. And I also have a minimum shutter speed. Now this is important. Essentially, you are telling the camera when you would like it to increase the ISO to make the sensor more sensitive to light rather than dropping the shutter speed in order to get the light that it needs. Now this really matters in program mode and aperture priority. Not so much shutter priority because you're selecting the shutter speed, and certainly not in manual because you're selecting both the shutter speed and the aperture. So if you shoot in aperture priority or in program mode and you have your camera set to auto ISO, number one, check the upper limit, the maximum sensitivity. It's going to be different for every camera because the next question is, what should I set it to? Well, if you have a newer full frame camera, you can go way high with that. If you have an older crop sensor camera, you're going to want to keep that pretty low. That's really personal preference in terms of how much grain you can tolerate in your images. Noise or grain doesn't really bother me, so 6400 on my D750 is fine by me. Of course I would prefer it lower. I go back and forth between when I shoot auto ISO and when I select it myself. Okay. But then you want to select the minimum shutter speed that you will allow your camera to drop to before it increases the ISO. I have mine currently set to 1/250th of a second, but that's not accurate. I could probably put that at 1/125th of a second, maybe even 1/100th. I don't shoot sports or a lot of fast motion, so if I had that set to 1/125th, in fact, I'm going to change that, I would feel pretty comfortable with that. So again, you select a maximum ISO with auto ISO and a minimum shutter speed. These are important. I now know that the default on the Nikon Z6, unless he changed it, but I don't think he did, the auto ISO, the maximum sensitivity was set to 51,000. Yikes. So he asked me what he should bring that down to, and I said, again, that's personal preference. Try it around 6,400, but I bet you could go higher than that, and it probably wouldn't bother you on that camera. It depends on what you're shooting. If I'm photographing a wedding, I'm paying attention to this, but if I'm photographing a portrait session or anything else that doesn't carry as much weight, at least not to me, then I'm not a freak about my ISO. I'm also not a pixel peeper. So you guys that are zooming in at 3,000% to look at your pixels when you shot at ISO 6400, yes, it is going to be grainy. But keep in mind, there is inherent softness in printing. And ultimately, every photo should be destined for print, ultimately, even if it's not. But your monitor is high resolution and it will show you more grain than you will actually see in print. So 2 things, relax and back off the magnification zoom. If you zoom in at 1:1, it should look decent. And listen, if you want to remove grain in Lightroom, of course, I have videos on that. You can remove grain, but when you remove grain in Lightroom, you also need to sharpen, because removing grain is actually blurring the edges of pixels, which is fine for the most part, but if you take it too far, you're gonna need to sharpen edges. So actually, 3 things happen. If I make the decision to lower the grain in Lightroom or blur it, remove it, lessen it, then I know that I have to sharpen, and I know I have to pay attention to my masking, because this sounds so counterintuitive. You want to blur pixels and then sharpen them, but you only want to sharpen them on the edges. So you have to watch the videos and make sure that makes sense to you. But to be honest, it's really rare for me to go in and mess with the grain in Lightroom. It really doesn't bother me. So the D750 up to 6400, my Fuji's up on the shelf. I haven't checked my Fuji, but I have not been shooting it in auto ISO. It's a dial, I like it. I put the ISO where I want it and I shoot. So I really want you to check that maximum sensitivity if you are photographing in auto ISO. Make sure that you are okay if it shoots to whatever you have that set to. And I don't know if you're okay with it shooting at ISO 51,200. Hey, and if you are, that's great. Whatever works for you. I hope that you found this useful. I'll see you in the next video.